Welcome to The Hill's Coronavirus Report. I'm Steve Clemons, editor-at-large of The Hill. Each day we are interviewing consequential leaders and innovators in the battle against the coronavirus. At this point, so many of us have seen COVID-19 really hit home. These times are not a joke, and the risks are real to many of our citizens. Whether we know someone who's been diagnosed or have a friend, colleague, or family member who's tragically died, and some have cared for a loved one diagnosed with the virus, this is all going on right now, and it is real. My next guest was in the unique position of being vetted as a running mate for presumptive Democratic nominee Joe Biden, while her spouse, John, recovered from the coronavirus. Along with her Senate colleagues, she voted on aid packages to get assistance to the millions of Americans out of work because of the pandemic. This pandemic has forced many to become at-home teachers for their children, to become Zoom aficionados working with their colleagues, to find ways to entertain themselves through online adventures to museums and lots of other stuff. But it's also making us rethink how we civically engage, how we campaign, and most importantly, how we vote. Senator Amy Klobuchar has become the Senate's leading advocate for nationally available mail-in voting and has been pushing hard for that legislation to assure that people don't need to risk their and their families' lives to engage in a key right and responsibility in our democracy. Joining me now, Senator from Minnesota, Amy Klobuchar. Senator, thank you for joining me. I've been watching your work on the mail-in voting, and I've been doing a lot of these interviews saying, how are we evolving as a society? What are the sorts of institutions we need to change that may improve us down the road? So tell us about why you're pursuing mail-in voting and how it's a function of these times we're in.
Well, people shouldn't have to choose, Steve, between their health and whether they can vote. I remember getting a letter from a Vietnam vet, and he said, you know, I served our country, and I have a pre-existing condition, and how can our country say that I can't vote? Because basically, the state that he was in had some pretty draconian requirements to get a mail-in ballot. State by state by state, a lot of these requirements are getting waived, even by Republican governors and secretaries of state. But we still have a situation where it is so hard for states to make these changes right now. Why? Well, traditionally only 25% of Americans voted from home, voted by mail. Now we're going to look at 60, 70%. And we wanted to get that high because it's safer. And that means postage, it means envelopes, it means a whole new structure. Just to give you a sense, the state of New York, originally in the last few federal elections, only 5% people voted by mail. Then you have a state like Oregon or Utah or Colorado, which is nearly 100%. So there's a lot of differences, and the states that are nearly 100% have been doing it for a long time. So my focus is helping states to get where they need to go so no one gets denied the right to vote. And that means keeping ballot places open earlier, 20 days is what our bill says, and then training a new generation of poll workers, since so many of our seniors are the ones that have been traditionally staffing the polls. And then finally, getting help financially with what you need with the mail-in ballots and the like. And that's in the HEROES Act in the House, my bill, and we want it to come over and pass in the Senate. It's a bill I've worked on with Ron Wyden, and we have so many co-sponsors, support of Michelle Obama's group, support of Voto Latino, and really support, at least for the funding piece of it, from Republican governors and secretaries of states all across the country.
Well, one of the things, this area much better than I do, but what I'm led to understanding is that states really figure out their own system, that states oversee their voting rules and their voting frames and methodology and polling places. How does this work with 50 different systems, if there are 50 different systems, plus the District of Columbia, of course? How does that work? And Puerto Rico and other places, but I mean, how do you deal with such dissimilar voting frames in around the country?
There is some virtues to the fact that states run their own elections. I mean, they're going to be doing it on the ground. But what we're trying to do here is put some minimal standards in. Just have the polls open for 20 days ahead. You can go more if you want. Train the workers. Make sure that you don't have egregious requirements in place. When we started on this journey with the pandemic, 12 states had requirements for witnesses or notaries. 6 of them had either 2 witnesses or a notary just to get a mail-in ballot. There's a story of someone with coronavirus in a hospital that was trying to get a primary ballot notarized through glass. That's crazy. And a number of governors have waived those. Some legislators have changed the rules, but there's still 3 states that have those kinds of things in place. So that's just one example of why a bill would fix it, because we could just put minimum national standards in place. The big focus right now as well, of course, is on the funding. And yesterday, while Senator Blunt objected to my bill, he's the chairman of the Rules Committee, I'm the ranking member, he cordially, I would say, said that he wants to work on the funding. So that gives me a lot of hope that we'll be able to get some funding in this next package, so the money can go immediately to the states to help them to defray the cost of this. Otherwise, I mean, imagine changing the whole election system as we're trying to do in just 6 months. It's really tough. And that's why you saw those voters standing, Steve, in line in Wisconsin with garbage bags and homemade masks. And then if you look at the split screen, you'd have the President of the United States voting in the comfort of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, but with his mail-in ballot from Palm Beach, Florida, in his slippers. I don't know if he's wearing slippers. I made that up to add some color to the interview. But the point is that that's what we got going right now if we don't fix this.
Do you have, I mean, you and I both know Senator Blunt, and he seemed to be fairly sensible in these things. Is he in favor of what you're suggesting or not in favor?
So he blocked the bill. He's not in favor of putting the standards in place, which I think would be such a good idea for the nation. But he has said many times publicly in his own state and on the Senate floor yesterday that he is very open to discussing further funding. We had already gotten $400 million over that in the first CARES Act. There's some problems with strings that some of the Republicans attached to it that I think we also need to fix, and many senators have expressed an interest in that. Some of the states have gotten the money, some have applied, everyone wants the money. But the idea is to make this work smoothly, get the money out immediately, and he's open to additional funding if another package is being negotiated, which I think must happen. As you know, that bill passed the House. It's got $3.6 billion to help states with elections. States are facing bankruptcy. They don't have enough money to pay for this major transition in 6 months. And so that's what we're talking about here in the Senate. What amount of money? How do we negotiate this?
I think that we have got a lot of people watching this coronavirus report, and we're talking about elections, and so it's a good time to focus a spotlight on good behavior and not so good behavior. Which states are superstar states that get this, understand it, leaning in, partnering, and which are leaning away from what you want to do?
Yeah, well, I would say I'm not going to. You saw what
Why
happened.
not? Put some pressure on them.
Okay, but listen, Wisconsin had a bad situation, not the governor's fault. If you remember, he was trying to delay. He went to court. The Republican-appointed judges stopped him. The voters actually got very angry and ended up voting for a Democratic favored judge over a Scott Walker judge. So I think my Republican colleagues saw what happened. Georgia had some major problems. An 80-year-old woman who had marched with Dr. King, Anita Hurd, talked about how she got there the first person at 6 a.m., but she didn't leave because she saw the lines forming and what went wrong there. And we know there's been problems in Georgia in the past. On the good side, you've got states like, of course, Colorado, and hasn't had their primary yet, but traditionally has had a lot of people voting by mail. Oregon, Utah, a Republican state. Senator Romney has noted that there's been no fraud, that it's worked well, that he's proud of the fact that his state votes by mail. Minnesota, my state, has traditionally had the highest voter turnout in the country. That's because of same-day registration, but yet we're only 25% vote by mail. So obviously we're making a big change to try to encourage more people to vote by mail. And so much of this is getting the education efforts out to the voters so they can figure out how to immediately apply by mail in each state, and each state is different. We're going to have to do that because we want people to vote safely.
Why, Senator Klobuchar, do you think President Trump is so fixated on blocking what you're trying to do?
He said it himself. I would love to break news on your show that I had some, special thing, but he has said that the vote by mail is going to hurt him in his election. That's what he said. So what does he do, which is his typical playbook? He then claims that it's fraudulent to scare people in a blatant effort to suppress the vote. He says it's fraudulent, yet if you look at a state like Oregon, which is nearly 100% vote by mail. And of course, by the way, you want polling places open. Let me make this clear. You need ample polling places. You don't want people to have to drive an hour to get to a polling place. And so it's got to be part of the equation as well. Not everyone's going to vote by mail. But in that state that has so many people voting by mail, the fraud rate is like 0.0000001% or something like that. It's crazy. And he is just saying this to scare people, to try to stop this way of voting that we know is the safest way of voting. And I just think people are on to him. And he's blatantly told us why he's doing it. He thinks he'll lose if people vote.
You know, one other dimension about voting, which we saw in the 2016 election, and you and I have spoken about this before, was Russian and other foreign meddling in our election system. You know, Senator Warner, other senators have sort of, continued to highlight concerns about foreign malfeasance in our election system. Does what you're proposing deal with that at all? Are we in better shape, worse shape regarding others meddling with our results, or is this just a completely different arena and not relevant?
Well, there is some of this because you're still going to have a bunch of people voting on election day and in the days leading up to it. So you still want to have the right equipment, and you still want to have the coordination with Homeland Security. You still have got the issue, which I'm not going to get into right now, but is huge propaganda on social media, lies, and paid ads and the like, where we haven't seen a lot of things fixed. But the great virtue of the mail-in ballots is you'll have a paper ballot. And what we were pushing for is backup paper ballots when people use voting machines. And there's still states like New Jersey that don't have them. But what we do have now, with more and more people voting by mail, that's harder to hack, of course, because you're going to have an individual signing a ballot.
Do you think we have to change our expectations about when we get voting results? I mean, I'm used to going to election parties and knowing who's up and who's down. What's that?
Yes. I mean, as we know, it's going to take a while to open up all these envelopes and look at this in that way. And I think we just saw that in the primary. That's going to be a change in that.
And some of the ballots come in, I mean,
some races you're going to know the results, and others you're going to have to wait a while, and it's going to change things. Yes.
Right. And some, I mean, I love our postal system. I love our postal workers. They work hard. But I just got a piece of mail that was sent 3 weeks ago by someone. So, I mean, when we begin dealing with our mail system, aren't you going to get ballots in after, or is there, how do you deal with late ballots? Because our postal system is not perfect.
Right, and a number of states in our bill would actually say, as long as it's postmarked on election day, that it's okay. So of course you're going to get those after the fact. You can't count them that night. And I would also add, we got to make sure the Postal Service is working and has the funding it needs to be able to do this. So it's going to change a lot of things, but it's going to not change one thing, and that is Americans should have the right to vote. This is a democracy. And the president, there's absolutely no doubt about it. I'm actually pleased that there are Republican governors, Republican Secretary of States all over the country that are basically standing up to him. Maybe they're not using the words, but they're saying, I've got to let my citizens vote safely. I have to let my veterans vote. I have to let my seniors vote. They get it. And otherwise, we no longer have a democracy. We have a dictatorship. And so the whole country is going to have to stand up. And this should be a major part of our efforts. And everyone, I was watching, in the next few weeks, we're going to have discussions and negotiations and hopefully get some version of the HEROES Act done in the U.S. Senate. So it's very important that it includes the election money.
Two other fast questions. Are you and your colleagues looking at ways in which we can move from paper and still vote at home? In other words, without paper ballots and mail, we've all been pushed online. This is a digital age, if there ever was one. Is there a way to begin thinking about doing this digitally?
Yeah, I think that always open to discussion, but I think the general belief of the Secretary of States across the country is we don't want to be messing with that right now, just because of the hacking potential.
Right.
And we just don't believe there's a secure way to do that.
And then lastly, you and I have done a lot of interviews over the years. You're pragmatic, you're in infrastructure, you think about this, and so you have a lot of ideas on how to improve the country. And my question is, I know you've stepped out of the presidential race. Would you ever be interested in applying for the job down the road?
I am focused right now on one thing politically, and that is making sure Joe Biden gets elected. And he will bring competence to the White House, vast experience in knowing how to manage things like he did with Ebola, with that pandemic, like he has with getting things done. And so that's my focus. And he's also going to bring compassion, decency to the White House. So many families, as you pointed out at the beginning of this interview, have been hit by this pandemic. So many of them haven't been able to say goodbye. So many of them, like I did this weekend with my dad, who's 92 and has corona, but is somehow still strong. I had to talk to him through a glass window. Oh, he couldn't really hear me. I did it over the phone. And that is what's going on in this country right now. Everyone, as you said, knows someone that's been hit. And you've got a president in the White House that not only didn't prepare us for it, not only didn't get the equipment moving like he should have, not only didn't get the testing, but then shows this complete lack of compassion for people that have hit by this. And also, of course, for people that have been so incredibly moved for change and justice after the George Floyd murder in my state. There's a lot going on right now in people's heads, and they want to see a decent leader that helps to guide them through this. That is not Donald Trump. That is Joe Biden.
Well, I want to thank you, and I want to thank you for those last comments, because this is a time it's real. I know someone that passed yesterday, and I made a comment in my editor's note in this report that I said, this is not a joke, this is not a time for clinical time. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Okay.
And I do hope you keep think about applying down the road. But thank you, Senator Amy Klobuchar. Thanks so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your thoughts. And I want to thank all of you for joining me. I'm Steve Clemons. We'll see you tomorrow. Be well.